Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Robert R. Wilson Distinguished Lecture. We are thrilled to welcome you today. My name is Manoj Mohanan. I'm the Interim Dean of the Sanford School. And thank you to all of you for joining us today for a very important conversation with Barry Berke. The lecture series today is supported by a generous endowment by Robert R. Wilson Charitable Trust. And a special thanks to our co-sponsors today, which is Polis, the Center for Politics, as well as the Duke School of Law. Thank you, Abdullah. So, our guest today, Barry Berke. Barry is a renowned trial lawyer. He's renowned nationwide as one of the leading lawyers in the country, white crime criminal defense attorney, and he's also the co-chair of Gibson Dunn's Litigation Practice Group and a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. Barry has served as the chief impeachment counsel to the United States House of Representatives during the Senate impeachment trial of President Trump. As lead counsel, Barry was instrumental in preparing and presenting a case that garnered widespread recognition across the country for its precise choreography and the compelling presentation of factual evidence and the constitutional arguments that he brought to the trial. Barry has been involved in a wide variety of election-related representations and litigation, and including advising and representing states, Congress, elected officials, as well as electoral campaigns. Most importantly, Barry is a proud Duke alum, and he returns to his alma mater today during an exciting time. 2024, as you know, is the 100th year of Duke, and today's lecture is the last lecture of 2024 as we finish out our Duke Centennial celebration. So thank you again, Barry, for joining us for this important event. It is also my pleasure to introduce my Duke Law colleague, faculty member Don Beskind, who will be joining Barry for a question and answer session at the end of his talks. Don Beskind is a professor of practice at Duke Law. He directs the trial practice program at Duke, and he teaches torts and evidence. A seasoned trial lawyer himself, he has represented plaintiffs in civil cases and defendants in criminal cases throughout his long-established career. Beskind is a co-author of 2 books on North Carolina evidence, a torts casebook, as well as numerous materials on trial and pre-trial advocacy. We look forward to the talk. I'll not get further in the way of a really impressive talk that's coming up. And without further ado, welcome, Barry. I'll jump across.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And it is a pleasure to be back at the Sanford School of Public Policy. I have to tell you, I received my first election education when I was an undergrad here at Sanford. I was here and I was eager. I volunteered for the campaign of then Governor Jim Hunt of North Carolina. He was handsome, moderate, popular, urbane. He had a beautiful family. I understand one daughter is now the lieutenant governor. He was going against Jesse Helms for the Senate race. Jesse Helms, who had been a segregationist till recently, and many thought his views were outdated and he was sure to lose. Jim Hunt was favored, double digits. This was a cakewalk. I went into this with such enthusiasm. Jim Hunt got beat badly in a very contested election. That was at the time one of the most expensive. And I learned a lot. I learned that elections are complex things, and I also learned to expect the unexpected. Since that time, I have been involved in a lot of elections. I'll make a full disclaimer. I am not an elections lawyer. I'm not someone who full-time litigates before, during, and after elections. But I get involved when folks think it may matter, and I've been involved in significant election disputes with legal issues representing states, elected officials, candidates, the House of Representatives. I did it when there were actual ongoing disputes, potential disputes. I did it when there are investigations following elections of my clients, and I also have done it for 2 of the 4 impeachments, presidential impeachments that our country has had in its history, both of which involved very significant election issues. And I will tell you, we were all expecting that these remarks may coincide with a very significant fight over the 2024 election. And what I can tell you is that both sides leading up to this election were preparing for the fight of the century that they thought really could test the limits of our democracy and our election system. So both sides were lawyering up, and I know that well because I was one of those lawyers. And the issues that were really so focused on such a fixation for everyone leading up, they did not get tested because the election was not the razor-thin election that people thought it would be. But those issues were not going away and will come up at some point in the next election or the elections after that. And I'll tell you, our founders of our country in drafting the Constitution and the principles underlying our elections realized that when election disputes happen, that would be the true test of our system of government and our democracy. And to me, the best example of that people talk about is when Benjamin Franklin was leaving Independence Hall for the Constitutional Convention in 1778, he was asked by a passerby, "Doctor, so what do we have, a republic or a monarchy?" And he responded by saying, "We have a republic if we can keep it." And I really think that the election tests really are a framing of that question. It's a republic if we can keep it. When we think about elections, and we're going to walk through, elections and the issues that really test our democracy usually turn on the very close elections, and they can define our times and become what actually leads to reform. It begins with the Constitution. Most of you probably know, Article 1 and Article 2 lay out the process for electing members of the House and the senators. It lays out the Electoral College, which to this day remains controversial, since it means you could have presidents who win the popular vote but lose the Electoral College. We've seen it 5 times in our nation's history, twice this century, in 2000 and 2016. And this century, in some ways, has been the most interesting century for elections, and we're going to talk about that. But what happened is after the Constitution was passed, again, there was a tight election, and it was
the election of 1800.
See, I do that because we're going to talk some about elections, and it might sound a little boring to be talking about elections, but the good ones become the part of history books or a Broadway show. I won't sing from Hamilton, but the election of 1800 was significant because it was Thomas Jefferson was running. He tied with Aaron Burr, who was of his same party, and back then, the winner of the election became president, the runner-up became vice president, and that was a challenge. And in this case, they were running against John Adams, the incumbent. They all divided up the vote. Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied. The House of Representatives had to decide, and everyone realized the elections aren't quite so clear in the Constitution. Then we got the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment made clear that there'd be separate races for the president and vice president, and also said, and this is significant, laid out what would happen if the election was not decisive, that the House of Representatives had to decide, and it made clear that each state would have one vote. And that's very important because this was almost a concern in 2000 and was very much a concern that this could be a broken election that the House had to decide in 2024 if it was close. And again, this would mean that with each state getting a vote, that Wyoming has the same vote for the president as California, because it is simply one state, one vote decided in the House. So whichever party dominates the members of the House for that state, that's who gets the vote. So that's the state of affairs until there were other controversial elections leading up following the 12th Amendment's passage, and they realized they needed more laws. So they passed the Electoral Count Act, which probably no one knows a whole lot about, but really lays out the principles for the elections all the way through the 2020 election. That was a very controversial election, and following it led to the first reform in 135 years, which we'll talk a little bit about and we were experienced. But the key provisions of the Electoral Count Act lays out that the state has an election, there are electors, they're certified by the governor or secretary of state, they go to Congress, Congress then certifies it on January 6th. Nobody paid a whole lot of attention to this until, of course, January 6, 2020, which would lead to some changes of the law. That sort of are the key provisions that you need to know as we enter and start talking about the key events of this century, which were really some of the most significant elections that defined where the law worked well and where it had limits. So the 2000 election, which some of you may remember as well as I do, others may not have been born. In 2000, it was Vice President Al Gore versus George W. Bush. Again, it's the razor-thin elections, the ones that are so close that determine the limits of the law. It came down to Florida. Came down my home county where I grew up. I can tell you where I was when the networks, which people watched at the time, first said that Al Gore won, then Al Gore conceded, then Al Gore receded his concession because Florida was going to decide the election. There was a new voting machine in Palm Beach County which poked holes in the ballots. Some of the holes didn't go all the way through. There was a hanging chad. And so ultimately the state Supreme Court said we're going to review. The U.S. Supreme Court said you can't review. And that is because the Electoral Count Act said that there was a safe harbor deadline where each governor has to certify their votes for them to be presumptively valid. That was the day after the Supreme Court argument. Supreme Court said, that's it, George W. Bush wins, no more counting, even though it was pretty clear to everybody that the votes didn't make sense because a lot of people showed up to vote, but they didn't count their vote. So it was clear there was a problem. Supreme Court spoke, and the loser, the Vice President Gore, he accepted the results. Elections, democracy mattered. So that's what happened. So go forward to 8 years later, the first real election, 2008. The candidates, and I know this, I ran then candidate Obama's litigation election war room for the 2008 and then President Obama's for 2012. And you know what we were focused on? Voting machines, right? Because that was shown to be the problem at the election of the time. So we had a war room of trial lawyers in Chicago with candidate Obama and his campaign, and we had every expert on every voting machine in the swing districts, the battleground states that mattered. Because what we learned from 2000 is if there's a dispute about an election involving voting machines, you have to prove it. It's not enough that you sort of can tell that was a problem, and you have to do it quickly. So we were ready to go. These issues almost seem quaint given what happened in the last contested election in 2020. But we were ready to go, and I remember, just to give you a story, I remember when the election was still too close to call, Pennsylvania at the time, like it was this past election, was a key state. And I remembered the key thing to remember is in Philadelphia, which was a Democratic stronghold, the voting machines were like appliances, not computers. Like microwaves, meaning if you unplug them, you lose all your data, all the votes. And I heard there was a dispute in Philadelphia. They said they were going to move the voting machines. I was just getting ready to lawyer up and head out there. And then John McCain, we heard, called and conceded, just as we were going to have a big litigation over, again, voting machines. That happened again 2012. That was the main focus. Nobody was really focused on any other concern or issue. And that's really where things were. Again, it seemed relatively limited. So then we get to the election of 2016. Now that turned out to be somewhat of a significant election. It in some ways was the greatest upset in the history of presidential elections. Donald J. Trump, of course, upset former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in the election and won. And the election itself was not that close at the end of the day, although Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and lost the electoral vote. But what became interesting was afterwards. After the election, there was evidence that a foreign country, Russia, may have had a role in the election. There was a question of whether candidate Trump may have invited Russia's role. Remember, there were some public statements where he said, Russia, if you can find Hillary Clinton's missing emails, which had been erased and thought to be somewhat harmful to her, he said that, and then there was some evidence that campaign officials may have spoken to Russian officials. So I was asked to be special counsel to the House Judiciary Committee to investigate these allegations. It would be a crime to have a foreign involvement in an election and whether there was a basis to impeach. So we investigated this, and there was a parallel criminal investigation by a special counsel because the DOJ was run by the Donald Trump administration. And I remember very well when Robert Mueller, the special counsel, testified before our committee and said there was not sufficient evidence of a crime of foreign involvement to bring a case. And to me, that was the end, really, of the foreign election involvement impeachment movie. And I thought it was done, and I was about to get ready to head back home soon. But there was a sequel. And some of you may remember as we talk about it, the day after the testimony of the special counsel, then President Trump had a call with the new president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, in a recorded call, and asked President Zelensky to release information about his feared rival, Joe Biden, that he believed existed based on some allegations of wrongdoing involving his son. And he said, and if you did that, I would release certain aid that Ukraine needs. And this became the full-fledged impeachment inquiry and very much involved the elections and whether there were constitutional crimes involved in that call. For that, I was asked to give the opening statement for the House Democrats in the impeachment proceedings, and really chose to talk about what said was the framers' biggest concerns about a president, and it really involved what I talked about as the ABCs of constitutional crimes. Abuse of power, because the president has a lot of power around election time. Betrayal of a national security, because Ukraine was feared a Russian invasion, somewhat prescient given what happened. And then most importantly, what I want to focus on is C, the corruption of elections. And that was really the issue. And I had said that if a president could get away with using the power of the presidency to interfere with an election, the only limit to what another president may do in the future is our imagination. And the House did impeach the president for that conduct. The Senate, as most of you certainly remember, did not vote to convict, although one Republican for the first time in our country's history voted to convict a member of this party. That was Mitt Romney. So that was really the end, and I was prepared. I went back to New York, my home, my family, for the 2020 election. Now, given what happened in 2016, there were a lot of concerns about what might happen in the 2020 election. I chose to represent pro bono the states of Pennsylvania and Michigan, and I advised a number of other states. And in some ways, what happened during the 2020 election highlights every issue that could come up in an election, every issue under the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, state laws, and the like. Because if you remember, the 2020 election in some ways was the biggest test of our democracy and our election system. It happened during COVID when everyone had to socially distance themselves. And elections are the antithesis of this, right? Everybody has to get close to give their ballots, to vote, to do everything. So how would the elections take place? And the states, almost across the country, stepped up. They passed new laws. They expanded mail-in ballots. They allowed for things like drive-in voting, drop boxes, and other procedures to allow people to vote, most of which was done on a bipartisan basis. And so in some ways, it was an extraordinary success because during this unprecedented pandemic, a record number of people voted, and it was a tremendously successful election in that way. This high point of our democracy, of course, though, was also met by a low point. And that was really unprecedented attacks on the integrity of the election, on whether or not these new voting procedures violated certain principles, whether there was cheating, whether there were things happened that caused the election to be unfair. And there was a tremendous amount of litigation. And so I advised a number of states. I chose to represent Pennsylvania and Michigan because they were unique and similar in that they were both battleground states that would matter. They both had Democratic leaders in their executive positions, the governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and very strong Republican legislatures. And the 2020 election also tested a theory about whether legislatures have unique powers. The Constitution says that the state legislatures would determine the manner of elections. So there was an argument and a question whether the manner says they could decide who the electors were if they thought the election was unfair. In other words, disregard the vote of the American people or in their state and decide the election. There was also in the Electoral Count Act language that said if it's a failed election, the state legislatures decide. but in unhelpful drafting by Congress, they never said what is a failed election. So there was a lot of disputes about whether legislatures could interfere with this election. And in the mix of it all, there was the safe harbor deadline that the governors had to meet in order to have a presumptive good faith if there were multiple electors or challenges. So everybody was racing to get this done. There were 62 lawsuits filed across the country, the most in Pennsylvania, the third most in Michigan, raising all sorts of issues and raising real questions about whether the safe harbor could be met. The challenges were issues that really define the challenges that can come up in elections. Did the states exceed their authority by allowing for expansive mail-in voting, by allowing mail-in ballots that come in after the election to be counted if they were mailed before? There's something that's very well known in election law known as the Purcell Doctrine. If someone wants to challenge a procedure, but it's too close to the election, judges have to say, I can't consider it because it could interfere with people voting. So there were all these questions that came up. And I would say in the end, the courts were a very effective institutional guardrail. They rejected 61 of the 62 cases. One case was very minor, but they played the role of the balance of power and what they're supposed to do to be a guardrail and allow the safe harbor to be met. You also saw the importance of state officials. You saw Republican and Democrat state officials, regardless of whether they were on the winning or losing end, step up. You saw it in Georgia, where the Secretary of State was famously asked to find 11,000 votes and said, I can't do that, and again, even though his candidate lost. And I'll tell you, in the state of Michigan, you also learned how so many of these laws that lasted for a long time were not met for this time when there were real challenges. So Michigan had laws that had been on the books for over 100 years, where at every level you have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans who serve on a committee, and you need a majority vote to certify at that level. And some of you may recall that in Wayne County, which is Detroit, it's a Democratic stronghold, there was a contentious Zoom hearing that went until midnight, and finally the 2 Republicans agreed to certify that the election was valid, which was critical for the governor to be able to act. After that, the then president called them about it, and they rescinded their votes. They said, I take it back, but they had done it at the meeting. The governor took it as certification, and he certified by the time of the safe harbor. And it really highlighted how some of these laws were not met for the time, where it was not simply enough to say the winner is the winner, even if it's a candidate who you didn't support. So it really raised so many different issues, but it was a success how it came through. And it was a good thing that all the states met the safe harbor, because there were multiple electors. Other electors that were offered up by some states, turned out they were fake electors, and there are ongoing criminal cases in a number of these states to see whether people should be prosecuted. But the issues were raised. The last phase of all elections for the president is the role of Congress. And again, the Electoral Count Act said January 6th, Congress would get together and certify the results. Now, we all know what happened on January 6th. There was a mob who interrupted and disrupted the events and the voting and caused great violence. 9 days after January 6th, I was back in Washington as chief impeachment counsel for the January 6th events. And it was a very different time to be back there because our jurors were victims. They were the Republican senators, and the trial was at a crime scene with the tape up and everything. And our goal during that trial, and again, the audience is not just the jurors, the senators, but the American people, was to make clear that January 6th did not happen because of a speech that day, but it was really conduct throughout the entire election. That before the election started, claims that if one side lost, it would have to have been because the election was stolen. During the election, when first the voting machine ballots came in, the results, because they're quick, but then the mail-in ballot results took longer because most states didn't allow them to be counted till election day, the claim that it was being stolen, which is why the numbers changed, and then after the election, those claims. And it was important for us both for the trial purposes, but also to get people to focus on the things that were not right about our election laws and how they were exploited and how the conduct was more than just a one-day event. Ultimately, The House obviously had impeached. The 7 Republicans joined the 50 Democrats to vote to convict. Others did not vote, although said they thought the case was proven, but because they did not think under the Constitution you could convict a former president, they did not vote to convict. Interestingly, and a lot of people had not focused on this, the penalty under the Constitution for a former president, if they're convicted, is that they're barred from ever running for office again, which many at the time, ironically, thought it was not necessary because the events would take care of themselves. And it's interesting, they were wrong. One thing that should give hope to everyone is after January 6th, after the 2020 election, after the impeachment proceedings, both parties did get together. There was bipartisan support to reform the laws. And for the first time in 135 years, the Electoral Count Act was reformed and turned into the Electoral Count Reform Act, which addressed many of the issues that were problematic. Took out the language about the legislature having a role. It made clear that the vice president's role was purely ministerial, because if those folks remember, there was pressure on Vice President Pence to reject the electors himself. It was made clear from both parties that's not the case. It also had a firm deadline for the governors to certify, getting rid of the safe harbor, which created sort of a target to try to force them to miss, created a procedure for judges, special judges to be appointed to have to rule in days, so that wouldn't force any deadlines to be missed. And it had other challenges, and importantly, it said that for Congress to actually challenge electors on January 6th, it's no longer just one vote for the House and one for the Senate to challenge, but you needed a fifth of both houses to challenge. And the bases to challenge were very limited. So actually, if you think about it, this was an act that governed elections for literally a century and a third, and nobody thought to change it. But a razor-thin election that showed the problems, caused people to be concerned about our democracy, led to significant reform. The states, they changed their laws. Michigan, Pennsylvania, which had really hard laws to deal with when folks were trying to push it and contest whether it was a legitimate election, they changed their laws, as did other states, including North Carolina. The Supreme Court stepped up. They issued a very key decision in Moore v. Harper that rejected this doctrine that legislatures have some supreme role in elections and can overrule their own Supreme Courts. They rejected that. So in many respects, the election of 2020 did cause a lot of change, almost as much as the election of 1800. And that really set the table for the election of 2024. And of course, with all those changes, nobody was worried about 2024. It was going to be fine. Absolutely not. Because now both sides were much better prepared, much more sophisticated, and could see damage and how you could try to push the buttons. So I will tell you, certain lawyers were preparing, including me, were preparing for challenges to the constitutionality of the Electoral Count Reform Act. Is it constitutional? Challenges to the original act, portions of which still existed. Was that constitutional? And then at every phase, there was a concern of what challenge could happen before the election. Would there be challenges to the, again, further challenges to the use of mail-in ballots extensively? Would there be challenges to when the electors were supposed to meet at the Electoral College that other electors would challenge them? Would governors before that have trouble meeting their deadline in time, and what would happen then? Would, at various points in time, there be challenges before Congress met? Would Congress say, we don't care about the Electoral Count Act, we're not following it, we think it's unconstitutional? Would they have that vote? Would there be other rules or other challenges? And would there be enough challenges that Congress would say, we don't think there are enough electors that are clear to decide this election, Congress will decide it, with each state having a vote, which was a concern again in 2020 and could come up again because that's what the rules provide if there is no clear winner. So these issues obviously did not get tested because the election was not the close one that people thought, but those issues did not go away. And it's important that I think folks focus on that whether it's the election of 2028 or another election that happens later on, it is very likely that these issues, now that they have been identified, now that they're the focus of sophisticated lawyers and political folks who are interested in how to sort of maximize their chances of winning, that these battles will be met at some point. And I have focused my remarks principally on the presidential races because I think that's where most of the action has been, and that's what gets a lot of attention. But I'll tell you, these issues can come up in other races as well. And following this presidential race in 2024, the Congress was for a period of time looked to be very close. Right? The Democrats and Republicans were very close. There were a lot of uncalled elections, and there were a lot of questions and issues raised about what would happen in all these races in California that were undecided. What if someone was certified the winner and the Congress in power said, we reject them, we don't think they won? What happens if there's a winner who is the 218th vote for a party, then in a recount has decided not to be the winner, and they have to certify another candidate? How does that work? And all these issues, again, remain untested until they're tested, but really push the limits to our democratic system and what matters. So I will tell you, I didn't know that I'd only be talking about these election issues here as opposed to in a court or somewhere else in a real election, but it is a pleasure to be here. And I just wanted to leave these thoughts with you as we think about future elections, and obviously we're going to answer questions and the like. But my experience, I will tell you, when I first became involved in these election disputes, I had always assumed that the principles that our founders had in deciding what our elective governmental system would be, that they were ingrained in our democracy, in our Constitution, and in our laws. And what I've come to realize is that they are mostly guidelines that until recently no one had the temerity to challenge. But once they're challenged, they really do require a collective will to say that these elections matter and that we have to sort of rise above partisan politics, whether our candidates win or lose, and recognize not just the right to vote, which has been a battle for the last century, but really the right to count all the votes and the importance of guaranteeing that the winner of the election is recognized by both sides, up and down the ballot. And I think for all of us, whether our candidate wins or loses, what we can do is help spread the gospel, that it really does require regular folks all over the place to recognize the importance of our elections and to respect the integrity of the process so that, again, when people vote, when people of all ages look at these elections, they can have confidence that their vote will matter and that our democracy actually works. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Good evening, everybody. We have a microphone set up over there for folks who have questions. It's also intimate enough that if you want to not get up and ask your question, I'm happy to repeat it. So let me start off with a question. If you were approached by a George Soros or someone with nearly unlimited resources, maybe not as much as Elon Musk, and you were given the mission to design a program to fix what needs to be fixed, where would you start?
Don, one of the things that I would do is I would want to have a real education system. Because I do think if the issues are addressed by regular people outside of a razor-thin contested election with all sorts of allegations being thrown about both sides, it's hard for people to see clearly or to know what they believe in, especially when folks get news from separate sources and often from news sources that they generally have a viewpoint. And that's wrong for both sides. So what I would want to do is make people focus outside of a real election dispute on just some key values. I think most people agree that the real winner should be recognized. I think people agree that elections are hard, that we should respect election workers who are actually trying to, go through a process. It really is quite extraordinary in our country how our election system works. It requires so many things to come together and work well. But what's frustrating is that in the midst of a heated debate with tight deadlines, if you start making allegations, as is often the case, it's so hard to prove a negative. So people don't know what to believe, and people then lose faith in the system. People then don't vote, or they don't agree with the outcome. So to me, I think there is no perfect system. I can identify some technical changes I would make, but the big thing that I would want is the education, so that the American people are better prepared and armed at all levels to be skeptical when someone says, which either side from a party, gee, I think that was an unfair election because I lost.
And do you think that's a bottom-up thing where the education begins at the local level, or is it something that we need to do on a national scale?
Don, you said something to me beforehand that I've experienced in different ways, and I think when people of either party, either perspective, whatever they think about election, get involved in some level and see how it works, people will defend the process because it's the only process we have and it's our democracy. When it's in the context of a candidate or one election where people are terribly disappointed, I think people are more vulnerable to believe things that maybe aren't true. So I would look for opportunities to people get involved. Don was telling me a story where he sees folks in his work who really are committed to the election process, the elections that they work on. And I have seen again and again state officials whose candidates have lost, but who've done the right things. They may not have done it as publicly as you saw in Georgia, but I can't tell you the number of folks who are not of my party, who didn't support my candidate, but have told me and have shown me that they are acting consistent with their oath, because that's their obligation to the people of their state. So there are true heroes up and down at the state and local level, but the American people don't always see it. And for them to be heroes, often they have to not be public about it. So while that exists, and I think those are sort of the best stories, I just think people have to understand a little better how this works. Like, again, I'm always struck, I speak to groups of lawyers, judges, others, but people aren't experts on the Electoral Count Act. Like, everybody knows what a hanging chad is because we had a Supreme Court case about it. But in terms of the key provisions that will only become relevant in a disputed election, most people really don't understand it until they become the object of the dispute when partisanship is at its most extreme.
You know, one of the things is I've been involved in elections since 1992 as the one party's lawyer in this county. And a couple of years ago, I stepped onto the Board of Elections, and I was shocked to find out how little I knew about what really goes on and how complicated the system is. When we have people who come to ask questions at Board of Elections meetings, they are questions that indicate that they've been listening to sources with inaccurate information. And so I can't agree more with you about this notion of education. Let's have some questions from you folks. I see a hand, yeah.
I just want to confirm what you just said. I've been a poll worker in 2022 and 2024, and I had never done anything like that before. And what's going on here in North Carolina right now is contesting of 60,000 votes, where the argument is being made that the signatures do not match, the ones that were put on the absentee ballots do not match, or the HAVA forms do not match the signature that was made when they originally registered. And I can tell you all, especially people who are younger, that when you sign credit cards and you just go zoop like that, there were a lot of people who were doing that on the back of their envelopes, and those are the ones that are under contestment right now. Or you get people who, as they get much older, they start writing sort of upways or whatever, and a little bit shaky, and we saw a lot of that, because we have to do that in North Carolina to just get a ballot. And if those don't match, that's what they're arguing about. And it's personally offensive because I could see this happening. So I just want to confirm what you said. I really would like people to either be working in elections and seeing what I saw. It's incredibly safe here.
No, but that's so helpful. And when you're dealing with it in a court case or just in a public arena that's so far away from that. And you simply say there are, 1,000 phony votes when the phony votes are whether someone's picture of their hair was parted on the left or right, or the signature and the like. Having that practical experience and getting people focused on what can be the basis of a challenge, I think would be very helpful.
Other hands, I saw some. Over here? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I can wait.
We have time for both of you. Go ahead.
Hang around to take it back. I was wondering whether the Constitution has a bearing on whether there should be mandatory voting, as in Australia, where there's a financial penalty for not voting.
Well, that would require a very different system. and I will tell you, it is interesting. I will tell you, so I've done a lot of election work, and so often you're looking at what the founders are did they think about that? Did they think about mandatory voting? And the one thing that has been so struck, now a lot of this is Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist Papers, which covered a lot, but it's elsewhere. For example, when representing Pennsylvania and Michigan, a concern were armed militia who were threatening to come into the voting booth and bring their guns under, the various laws of those states. Could it happen? Could we go to court to block them? And you look, and believe it or not, the founders did think about it. Yes, there was a Second Amendment, but they also didn't believe guns really, had a place in the voting booth. And so ultimately, there were practical solutions, and folks, did the right thing, and law enforcement stepped up. But at the end of the day, there were so many issues that actually our founders thought about. They did not in any way give any voice to mandatory voting, but I think it's for a reason. It is interesting if you actually look at what the Constitution says, and you can make arguments why. It says very little about voting, right? It says legislatures will determine the manner of voting. It lays out an electoral college that was intended to make sure people had support throughout the country, which I think was a concern at the beginning of our nation. So it does, give votes for the same number of House of Representatives and senators in each state, which exists to this day. So they gave a lot of thought to a lot of issues, but it's an interesting question why in our democracy it was elective and not mandatory. But there's no indication that that was ever thought about. Would you support it? Interesting.
We had another question over here and another one over there.
Okay, great. I'll ask this quick one. So just building on the last point, Barry, so you described to us all the challenges that have come about, and you told us how oftentimes it's the razor-thin cases where we come to realize that there is a problem, and that goes to court. It gets litigated, and oftentimes we are under time pressure to get that done. Is there a different model? So for example, if we were to tell our students in public policy or across the street in the law school to say, can you now help us think about the 50,000 things that could go wrong and preemptively start thinking about how do you resolve them? Has that been done? Or is there really no way to do it but wait for things to go wrong?
The challenge is we are in such partisan times. Often the battles about changing the rules turn on whether or not one side thinks it'll be more helpful to them or not. You would think that there would be arguments in favor of expanding who can vote, how people vote, different ways. We saw during COVID that if you make it easier for people to vote, expand absentee ballots, do other things, more people vote. And so it was great to see after January 6, 2020 or 2021, this bipartisan support to just make the laws better, to remove these pressure points and fault lines that everyone was concerned almost upended the 2020 election. But it's a rare occurrence. So often the debate seems to be about whether or not we need to make elections more secure or more available, but often it turns on a partisan question, which side thinks that rule change will be more helpful.
So I hand up over there.
I don't really think I have a good point to this question, but just thinking about the Constitution, and it seems like a lot of the Constitution is procedural, talking about this is how you elect a president, this is how the House of Representatives works. I'm curious, though, about the part of Section 4 that mandates a Republican form of government, which is like a substantive question, but there's a lot of ambiguity there, and I don't think it's ever really been legislated over how democratic the United States should be. And like, I guess if you have any thoughts about that, if people in political, electoral lawsuits have any thoughts about if the Supreme Court would ever say something on that.
No, listen, it's a great question. I think what the recent events of a number of elections this century have shown is that much of what the Constitution had was general and not as clear as it could have been. What does it mean to say the legislatures determine the manner of selecting electors? Does it simply mean the time and place of voting? Does it mean something more? Again, I think that in the Constitution itself, it was clear that they anticipated laws that Congress would pass to further define this, to enhance some of the rulings, and that's why we had the Electoral Count Act. But that is a great question. There are all these provisions that folks haven't really addressed and aren't entirely clear what they mean. When both, more so in the impeachments, but also in some of the election battle, often in trying to determine basic questions, right? For impeachment, the Constitution provides for high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, what is a high crime and misdemeanor? It's not entirely clear, and there is debate about it. You have to look at the Federalist Papers. It doesn't have to be a crime. It's a constitutional crime. And there were arguments that, well, maybe it has to be a statutory crime, right? You have to prove that someone could be prosecuted for it, like an election law crime. The problem was when the founders drafted that language, there were no criminal statutes, right? So it seems like that couldn't have been the case. But these are open debates, and I think that's a great question of why are there so many principles that even now, this deep into the history of our country, those issues have remained open. Now, a lot of that ambiguity around elections was tested in 2020. Some of it was addressed, but there's certainly going to be more issues that come up in future elections. And again, that's why I think there is no way we're going to make every law today as clear as it could be with the benefit of hindsight, because there are going to be people who find new ways to challenge it or raise different issues depending on the context. But I think what we can all be is committed to certain principles. The right to vote for people who are eligible to vote, the right to count the vote to make sure votes count, and the right to respect the winners of that. But I think as we see it, and I look at the Electoral Count Reform Act, which was a reform effort, but it was anticipated there'd be new litigation around the meaning of the new laws, even though they were all focused on addressing ambiguities of the earlier law.
We'll get, all right, go ahead.
I just want to, thanks. I just wanted to perhaps address an elephant in the room, which is that, no, I don't actually think that this election was razor thin. I mean, was a mandate. I think it was a lot closer than most people think. And had the other person won, I believe that you might not have made it tonight because you would have been sort of busy.
Well, no. Listen, that is a question of what does it mean? So I will tell you, when I think of it, is it an election that turns on one or two states in which there is a small number of votes or electors that at stake? Like where is the challenge? Like if you determine there's something wrong in Florida, could that determine the election? You were right, though, that the 2020 election normalized raising allegations and hoping the proof follows. And there's some great quotes that I have before I decided to spare you some of my quotes and what I was going to remark. But a Third Circuit judge who was a Trump appointee had a beautiful, long statement about the importance of our democracy, and proving an election to be false or stolen doesn't require just saying it, it requires proving it. And so, again, it doesn't take much to make a claim. The question is to support it. And, there are folks out there who say in 2020 there were a lot of claims by people who were pretty unsophisticated and who themselves didn't fully understand the fault lines in our election laws and the Constitution. After 2020, there's a whole set of lawyers on both sides who are very, very sophisticated about the laws and how to push places where there may be vulnerabilities. So again, in talking about this race, what would have happened if another candidate won? You voice concerns that others have voiced, but at the end of the day, because it did not appear for either side to come down to either a single state or a small enough number of votes, all those issues were not raised. And I will say, if losing side, let's say it was Vice President Harris, decided, okay, I'm going to claim it was stolen, I'm going to challenge it, it'd be much harder, right? Because now she'd have to overcome not one state, multiple states. And this is not to say that's not a reason to do it, but I do think the premise of some of my remarks is that it is the very, very close elections that don't come up that often, but do test the limits and the fragility of our system and are the ultimate tests of our democracy, as the founders thought. So you're not wrong that it could be that any side, no matter what the numbers are, could challenge the election, but it's where it comes down to such a small number that it really tests how committed people are to our democracy and our election system. That's all. I can tell I'm not persuading you, though.
Gentleman over there, please.
Hi, this is Andres from the MIDP program here at Sanford. I have to say that thank you very much. It's been very informative as an international student. I think it's very historical moment to be here, and then we have a lot of lack of awareness of how it works. So thank you to you, it helps a lot. And my question is, okay, now you said a lot about the history and what's been happening. So what is coming up next? What do you see in changing or improving in the trends going on in the next few years? And maybe specifically a topic that I see as an outsider, it feels to me that because there is basically a two-party system, here you guys are more divided than united. It's like you are blue or you are red, and you have like this, huge gap. Is there anything you see that is going to bring people more together? Because it's like our country, is this our nation, and it's not, oh, we are divided in two?
Yeah, you're bringing back some bad memories for me because I travel a lot for my work, and it's always when I'm abroad I get asked the hardest questions. Oh, you, America, you were so great. What happened on January 6th? Where are all those people? That doesn't happen. Your system, and it's often the most skepticism. I think in part because we are often so proud of our system and believing that it is the greatest, system of government that there is. I think, again, I've played enough music, but to answer your question, I'd have dramatic music because I do think it's like when problems or, opportunities are exposed in a system, where and how that will be exploited going forward is hard to know. I will tell you that for 2024, I think both sides had a long, long, long list of issues that they were prepared to potentially be litigating or arguing about over the election if it came up. And I think, again, a new law creates greater clarity, but it also creates newness, right? It creates new opportunities to raise questions about some of the new procedures and processes. That's for both the new federal law as well as state laws. So I think the hardest part is anticipating where these challenges will be, other than to know that they will exist. So I think to the extent the time for people to sort of show that their support of our systems and the strength of our processes is between elections. And hopefully people are not going to forget the anxiety people were feeling leading up to this election, and to recognize that, again, we are at a high state of partisanship, where it's very hard to get a common ground. We saw it following the last election, and I do think when you break down elections to core principles, abstractly, you will get agreement in our country that it is a system that is a good system, that we should recognize the right to vote, the right to count votes, the right to recognize the winners. But the hardest part sitting here looking forward to where the next place to parachute in may be is that we don't know where that may be. Other than in preparing for this election, you can see, there are 5 phases of the election, right? Or more if you include leading up to the election, but it's the election. It's for the presidential election. It's the election. It's the electors, being certified. It's the electors meeting. It's the time between that and Congress meeting. It's Congress meeting. So at any one of those stages, there could be challenges that could disrupt the election for the presidential election. In congressional and Senate elections, you can have similar types of issues at any stop of the process, the more abbreviated process, but those should all be real concerns. And it's a great question. Yeah.
We have a question over here.
Oh, thank you. Where do you stand on the Electoral College, and do you think that whole system is broken like I do, or not? Question is, if the states were, the electors in every state represented the popular vote of that state, and a president couldn't be elected by just 4 or 5 states, basically, Do you think we would have as many of these problems if the electors actually represented the popular vote in their states?
So that's a great question. It's a question asked by a lot of people, right? Who the Electoral College goes back to the original Constitution, and the process is the same. And many people wonder. You look at these votes. Again, we talked about it 5 times. Popular vote wasn't good enough. Is it undemocratic? Should we change it? Should we should we have a new system? Should we improve it so that each vote counts and it doesn't matter, the votes for people in a small state don't count as much as, don't count more than those in a big state? I sometimes have been heard to say that what I like when I'm involved in issues or trying cases, I like winning. And this is an issue where I know there's no winning arguing for getting rid of the Electoral College. It would require a substantial consensus of people to change it, and there have been various efforts at times. So I think it's an interesting question. I understand what I think are very valid concerns that it is undemocratic, but I think it's here to stay and we're going to stick with it. So I think when folks focus on things, just to my mind, while I understand all the concerns raised about the Electoral College, and I think they're valid, I think it's highly unlikely that certainly in any time in our near future there's going to be the consensus to make that change.
That's too bad.
So that's a thing that cannot be fixed. What's a thing that can be fixed? What do you think is out there that might be a consensus people from both sides might be willing to do that would improve the system?
That is a great question. And again, we saw it, right? It may have, you leading up to 2020, think about how contentious that election was and in its aftermath, but sides on both sides recognize that there's a problem here that we have to address. Listen, I still think we could simplify our system, right? We could, it would be great if some states had more uniformity, but clearly under our system, states have authority about how to conduct elections. We saw during COVID that if you make elections, make it easier for people to vote, more people will vote. More people of all ages who may have trouble going to the polls. So I would again like to see some efforts to try to, whether this is a commission or some efforts to have recommendations for states to consider seriously to improve the methods, adopt some of the more successful ways for people to vote so that you have folks voting. If you have folks voting earlier and you allow counting earlier, it's much easier to actually get accurate votes. You don't have to do a rush between election day and time to meet all the other deadlines. So really, I would like folks to sort of take off their partisan hat and put on their practical hat and try to think if folks can think about how can we just make this easier for states, easier for election workers, easier for everybody to try to avoid the sort of disputes, because oftentimes elections are really chaotic, right? If you aren't allowed to count votes, and I get there's a principle to say you shouldn't count mail-in votes in some states until the election, but if you could make it easier so that you have a more orderly process, I think it's one that ultimately people would have greater confidence in and would also allow for, to not only have more accurate information quicker, but also do it in a way that the American people could feel good about.
Talk to your friends in Pennsylvania.
I hear that. That's a tough issue.
Hi, thank you for speaking tonight. I work for the Sanford School, but prior I worked many election cycles, including in Michigan, so I really appreciate your examples about that state. And the question I have is about something I heard from many voters or potential voters who were apathetic. And they often told me that gerrymandering was a huge issue that kept them away from the polls and from voting in any election. They felt that their votes were being thrown away because it was not a very fair map. And Michigan is actually fairly good in terms of other states in the US in terms of gerrymandering. So I'm wondering, what is the legal pathway to resolving that issue in the US? I know we have about 13 states that are considered the worst for gerrymandering. So on a state level or federal level, what is the pathway to rectify that?
I wish I knew. My home state, New York, right, had a disaster with gerrymandering, right? The Democrats took it and gerrymandered in a way that the court thought was so favorable that the court appointed an independent, a court-appointed person to divide up the state. That ultimately, then it was changed differently. Listen, I think every time I think the courts are not going to correct what seems to be such an extreme gerrymandered situation, the courts do step up and say, no, that's gone too far. So there's no clear answer. Ultimately, it's the courts who play a role unless states on their own take it to come up with a better system to try to remove some of the partisanship that often defines it. Because you can look for whether it's Democrats or Republican, whichever party is in charge, if they have the ability to set where the lines would be, the other side is going to argue that it was done in a way to favor them in the elections. So, but I think it's a significant problem. If you look at some of these states, how the lines are drawn, it's hard to justify, particularly when they penalize underrepresented voters in those states by either expanding what a district may be. So I agree with you, it's a significant problem. I can't say that I have a great answer other than the hope that the courts would be more proactive and states would be more proactive in having a fair, less partisan process for doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you again. It's been wonderful seeing you and hearing from you the whole day. What is the likelihood of getting money out of politics? Is that also another utopian dream? Like in several democracies, there are examples, there are incredible limitations of how much money is put in the election system, or government sponsors legal parties instead of individuals and corporations are giving this. Is this something that could be done? At least can the influence of money be limited than what it is now?
Can I answer that question in 2 words? Citizens united. We're a country of laws, and our Supreme Court has ruled that most of the limits on giving are unconstitutional, and so right now it's a free-for-all in terms of money and how it's spent and the like. Again, that doesn't prevent there being clear legislation, clear restrictions, clear information disclosures about money. I mean, various, you see cities have tried it with matching funds, so New York City and others, and there are different systems. But right now, I think we are at a high point in the influence and role of money in elections. And unless either there's some greater legislative action or a change in, sort of judicial, views of giving in elections and the rights to do that, I think it's going to be very hard to take money out of the election, but you can certainly see how it can skew the results and give great power to those with great wealth.
Thank you.
Let me get the bottom part, yeah. Okay, did I see another hand? Yes, in the very back.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the talk tonight. I was just going to ask, one of the things that's really concerning to me is sort of the state of the VRA and perhaps the elements of the Voting Rights Act are under attack today, specifically with the reversal of the doctrine of preclearance or maybe strict voter ID laws, photo ID laws. And so I was wondering, how do you evaluate the state of the VRA today, and do you think that maybe there's a necessity for an advancement of that through something like the John Lewis Voter Rights Act or something like that?
Yeah, no, I mean, you raise great views, and there's just a tremendous partisan divide on that issue. And so I think there's a lot of support for, the need for new laws and making sure the right to vote is protected and expanded. But there are views on the other side that are expressed that raises concerns about, folks voting who don't have a right to vote. So I think that, again, there was a time when there was great consensus about the need for, greater voting rights and expanding the ability of people to vote. But I think it is a current challenge to think about how to do that. And if anything, I think the trend has shown it going in the wrong direction, in my view. And it sounds like in your view as well. But I don't have a strong thought other than to keep battling. And I find on all these issues, the pendulum shifts back and forth. And it's not just a partisan issue always, but that people see, and whether it's an election where folks who wanted to vote couldn't or something else happens, I think you keep battling and the opportunity will hopefully present itself if it is the case, as many feel, that there are many out there who should be eligible to vote, who want to vote, but have not been able to vote because of artificial barriers to them voting. So I think I would just tell people to keep fighting, and the moment will come, just don't know when that will be.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. So over the last few election cycles, we've seen just this massive erosion of democratic norms. Everything from the lack of a peaceful transition of power to, calling up the Secretary of State and asking them to find 15,000 missing votes. So in light of In light of the legitimacy that's just really been granted to these violations of democratic norms that our country was really founded upon, and in light of your recent work, do you see that there's a clear point where the law and the legal process just fails to address these issues facing our election landscape, or is that a more nuanced question?
No, listen, it's a great question. Your premise is a good question, right? January 6th was the first, was the greatest interference with the peaceful transfer of power, even more so than during the Civil War, right? And it was significant. Now, what I would say in response, though, is our founders anticipated there would be these challenges. It's a republic if we can keep it. So I do think our democracy is tested. But again, people voted, right? We had, people showed up to vote. People believed in the vote. People got involved in the election. People were enthusiastic. People did not lose their faith in democracy. So again, I would say whether your candidate wins or loses, it's important to reiterate faith in the democracy and the process. And the flaws, again, there are many that still exist and continue to challenge many people's confidence in the process, particularly when they're disappointed about the result. But I do think these are the tests, and hopefully, again, we had one significant change in the Electoral Count Reform Act, which was significant. States made changes. There are a lot more changes that are necessary, but I think people have to say we believe in the strength of our institutions and we have to keep fighting for them.
I think that may be a lovely place to leave it. You started with Republic if you can keep it. We're sort of ending there, and maybe that's a good message to all of us. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Stay put.
Thank you again. Barry's much taller than I am, so I need to bring this down. Thank you again, Barry, for joining us, and thank you, Dawn, for moderating the questions. We invite all of you to please check your email for our online evaluation form that we'll be sending out for today's event. We value your feedback, so you can tell us about how we can do better. And while this concludes our 2024 Distinguished Lecture Series, please keep a lookout for our announcements about the next set of lecture series for 2025 that will be coming up soon. If you are interested in learning more about the Sanford School, as always, please visit us online at sanford.duke.edu and follow us on social media. Thank you again for joining us. Have a lovely evening and stay warm.